The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
Good morning. Welcome to the Story of Tennessee workshop. Thank you for being here. I'm Stacy Graham. I'm with the Teaching with Primary Sources program at Middle Tennessee State University. And at MTSU, I work in the Center for Historic Preservation. That's the department where I work, and my colleague also, Kira Duke, whom you may have seen at other of our workshops. And I also teach in the Department of History, where I test out some of these activities on some of my own students and can attest to some of their success with some college level students, which in my experience are not all that different from high school level students, but probably a tad different from 5th grade students, let's hope. This is geared towards any grade level because we're going to be talking about strategies and social studies practices and online resources, but we are trying to build up a bunch of new materials specifically for the new Tennessee curriculum standards that are coming out for 5th grade starting this fall. So that's where a lot of our activities today are going to be geared. But if you're not a 5th grade teacher, it's okay. You should be able to get something useful out of these, I hope. After all of our introductions, we're just going to do quick brainstorming with those purple Post-it notes. And then we are going to hear from our special guest speaker, Dr. Carol Busey, whom you may recognize from documentaries on Nashville Public Television. She's a very experienced speaker about women's history and about Tennessee history. So there should be a small stack of purple Post-it notes at the end of these table rows. And if you wouldn't mind grabbing one or two and passing them down, what I would like for you to do, because I know we already know a lot about Tennessee history, and we'll go through that in a second, but I want you to also think about what you don't know or what you wish you knew more about when it comes to Tennessee history, particularly when you're considering how you would like to teach it to your students. So, I mean, there are a lot of things that just out of my own curiosity I'd like to know more about, but that I would never dream of bringing up in a classroom. But there are always things that we grew up learning if you're a native Tennessean that you find out later, oh, well, that's more complicated than I thought. Or if you're not a native Tennessean and you're like, why do people do things this way in this crazy state? Then you probably want to know more about that because there's probably a story behind that. So, before you start writing down things that you want to know more about, and then of course we'll make Dr. Busey answer every single one of them, right? She'll just cover everything. But let's go ahead and talk about stories of Tennessee history that you find interesting, that you find that your students find very interesting, that you think are very important to be sure that we include because they're significant to the way that we operate here in Tennessee today or think of ourselves as Tennesseans. So what kinds of things do you already know about the history of Tennessee? Like Civil War, right?
Well, yeah.
I mean, I suppose I should get more specific, right?
Most major battles were fought in Tennessee in the South.
Mm-hmm. All right. Tennessee has more major battles than any state except Virginia. Yeah, that's a lot.
We had 3 presidents.
Yeah.
Yeah, which ones?
Jackson, Johnson, and Polk.
Yeah.
We had the Battle of the Roses for women's voting rights.
Mm-hmm.
They got
Right.
passed by one vote because the guy's mom called him, told him to do the right thing.
Yeah. Yes, we last month I did a workshop in Memphis on women's suffrage that was in conjunction with the the Centennial Collaborative Symposium that they were having there. And we did a lesson activity on that Harry Byrne and his mother, and read a rather charming newspaper article where she goes on and on and on about how wonderful her son is. And that's actually from a newsletter that we did, I think last year. And so, yeah, we do have some materials for teaching women's suffrage, and Tennessee played a really pivotal role. And of course, next year, 2020, is the 100th anniversary. So we will be having a special women's suffrage workshop next year in conjunction with Tennessee State Library and Archives. So be watching out for announcements about that so you can join us. So what other things are pivotal to the history of Tennessee, the story of Tennessee?
You have to talk about Davy Crockett and...
Well, David Crockett, right? Davy Crockett as far as Disney is concerned. But yes, so David Crockett, a very important character, politician, and connecting the story of Tennessee also with further westward movement. Texas ought to thank us, right? Because they got most of their early settlers straight from us, right? So.
The failure of State of Franklin.
State of Franklin, yeah. That bizarre story there.
Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and the connection to the Manhattan Project.
Yeah, the Cold War in Tennessee. The Manhattan Project, Oak Ridge, and we have a graduate student who's actually doing her dissertation on that, and she worked with us last year and created a lesson plan about the creation of Oak Ridge. And so she pulled up a really interesting interview of a man who was stationed there, and he talks about how they had no idea where they were going, and whenever they would ask, where are we going, they'd get like the most vague, non sequitur answers, and just kind of the whole experience of what it was like to be out in the middle of nowhere and just have an instant city. So yeah, very interesting story, and important also for connecting Tennessee with the national stage. What other kinds of things?
The Indians, the many, many different Indians.
Yeah, right. Native American history in Tennessee.
That's where the name Tennessee comes from. It was a Cherokee meeting place, I think it was Tennessee, I think it was called, and that's where the name comes from.
Yeah, and there is you'll even see that maybe on a map later today. But that's something that, unfortunately, there's not as many sources on the Library of Congress for Tennessee's early Native American history, which kind of limits the materials we're able to create on that part of our story. Of course, there's a reason why there aren't as many primary sources from that part, but there are a lot more at, I think, TSLA. So we managed to create a lesson plan on the Trail of Tears, with kind of, again, working with limited sources from the Library of Congress, but that actually turned out very well. I have a colleague who works on a project with the National Park Service to identify structures all along all the different trails of tears across 9 different states. So that's a project that's going on right now. You can find really good updated brochures that show you just how expansive it was. And kind of how that played out. So it's exciting to be around while history's being kind of rewritten about that. So what other stories?
Music, the blues, rock and roll, country.
Yeah, you're welcome, everybody else, right? I think we can take credit for just about every bit of it. Music City, USA, of course, which let's hope Nashville stays that way. And from East Tennessee to West Tennessee, I don't think there's a single part of the state that can't claim like a really important American heritage. And like I said, we're going to be looking at Dolly Parton a little bit later today. Again, you're welcome, world, for giving you Dolly Parton. She's a living saint. So what else?
Wasn't there a Revolutionary War conflict in Tennessee that George Washington was involved in? I think he got got beat up pretty bad and had to escape. I'm trying to remember. I taught Tennessee history a few years back.
Oh gosh.
Up in the Tri-Cities area.
Well, there's a mustering point for the men who went to fight the Battle of Kings Mountain. Now, Kings Mountain did not take place in Tennessee, but the Over Mountain men mustered in East Tennessee, and then they went and fought with Ethan Allen. And so that's a very important story up in East Tennessee. And I kind of can't remember the details because that's not really my area of expertise, but we had a Revolutionary War workshop in Knoxville last December, and I know we talked about that, and I just cannot remember the exact details about it. But yeah, there's definitely a Revolutionary War connection, and also in that a lot of Tennessee was settled by people who got land grants from having fought in the Revolutionary War, right?
You got the Exodusters came out of Nashville, didn't they?
Exodusters, right? Pap Singleton. And his crew. Yeah, we have an interesting lesson idea on that too. Yeah, so many things in Tennessee that are not just our history, but a major part of national history as well. So if you would, please, on your purple Post-it notes, if you would write down some questions that you have that maybe you'd like to think further about, whether it's a strategy question on how to teach this to your students or a content question on why exactly did this happen this way? I want to know more about this. I think this is an important thing to include. What can I find on it? Whatever you want to ask where you want to find out something. And like I said, we'll try our best to address these. Maybe not every single one. And when you're done, if you wouldn't mind coming and posting it up on the board. I am going to turn the floor over to Dr. Carol Busey, who is a history professor here at Volunteer State Community College and a longtime friend and colleague of the Center for Historic Preservation. She's worked with us on so many different events, materials, documentaries. And so I'm going to sit down and be quiet.
Good morning. How are you all today? I'm delighted to see all of you here. I do have some handouts. I teach Tennessee history here, so consequently, I'm always looking for things that will connect the 16-year-olds with the 65-year-olds and with what they can learn about Tennessee history, and as well as that, what they might need to know, because I strongly believe that everybody who lives here in the state of Tennessee really needs to understand Tennessee history in order to just understand how things have developed here in Tennessee. So the first thing I'd like for you to do is take that blank map I gave you. This won't take but a minute. I would like for you to draw on your blank map the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River. It's harder than it looks, doesn't it? The 18 and 19-year-olds tend to take Tennessee history if they've already failed another history course on the grounds that, well, I've lived here all my whole life, I'll really know this one. I don't know U.S., but they think that this is going to be a walk in the park. And what students, no matter where they're from, what their educational background is, just by the common culture of television, everybody knows more U.S. history than they know Tennessee history. And so the way that I like to teach this and approach this is that there are three basic themes of Tennessee history, and everything fits underneath one of these umbrellas, one way or another. And so the very first theme is, how has the land affected the history? How did Tennessee's history develop and progress because of geographical reasons? Starting with the first people who came into the area, the Paleo-Indian hunters, coming along up through the Mississippian era, and where people settled, and all of those things are affected by our geography. Now, of course, Kurt Butefish would agree with me on this for sure if you've been to any of his workshops. I really believe that history is the mother of all subjects, at least in the social sciences. If history is taught properly, geography, economics, political science, all of those things will be covered in the course of telling the story. So I think you have to look at where everything takes place. Now, here is your blank map, and believe me, this is a challenge for everybody. So I'm giving you some maps. So I want you to look at this map, which is in the packet, and the geography department at UT made this map for me, and I really like it. I've got a big one that I carry around when I go into classrooms. But in order to understand history, you first got to understand the rivers. And people don't realize it, but when you're driving from Memphis to Bristol, or from that matter, from Memphis to Knoxville, you're going to cross the Tennessee River twice. The Tennessee River begins up in East Tennessee, right where Knoxville is, where the Holston and French Broad rivers come together to form the Tennessee. The Tennessee River meanders down this very circuitous path. The Powell and the Clinch come in, the Little Tennessee comes in, and then it goes all the way down here, Chattanooga, through here, and then it's going to make this sort of turn or change directions. And this is in large part because of the shifts of the earth and the ice ages and other things. So here we go, and we go through the Muscle Shoals area. Now, there's a lot of mention of shoals in Tennessee history. The Sycamore Shoals, where those Revolutionary War soldiers, they weren't really Revolutionary War soldiers at the time, but the Over Mountain men, the Wataugans, met and took off for what became the Battle of Kings Mountain. So these are the Muscle Shoals down here in Alabama. The Sycamore Shoals are at Elizabethton, Tennessee. They have a nice Watauga State Park, State Historic Park, and a reproduction of the Fort Watauga up there. Really interesting to see. And so the river makes another turn here and then starts flowing in a northerly direction where it flows to the Ohio River. Now, more or less, it is the Tennessee River that has created the three grand divisions, the 3 stars on the flag. And more or less, you have East Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, and West Tennessee. Granted, the Cumberland Plateau serves as much more of a barrier and a boundary between East and Middle Tennessee than does the Tennessee River. But the Tennessee River is very unusual in this trajectory. And so I like to say that, if you're in a canoe, which is physically impossible now because of a dam, the dams that are on the Tennessee River, but you're floating downstream and going south, which seems pretty natural, doesn't it? And then over here you're going downstream, but you're going north and up. You're going up on the map, and that seems rather counterintuitive. Now, the Cumberland River starts over in the foothills of eastern Kentucky, and it comes into the state, and it too has a rather circuitous route coming across here as into Davidson County. There you see all the bends across the city of Nashville, and it goes up to the Ohio River as well. This is where Paducah, Kentucky is. The Ohio then flows into the Mississippi, and the river goes out through the port of New Orleans into the Gulf of Mexico. Because these are so important to the settlement of the state, I really think that everybody really needs to kind of understand where the rivers are and their significance for our history. And of course, as you see from this map that I'm showing you, we've got the Appalachian Mountains, the Great Valley of the Tennessee River, the Cumberland Plateau, which was our Great Wall. That is a barrier, and that has some part to do with why people over here came and jumped way over here to make the Cumberland settlements. And then over here, you've got the Central Basin, this dark green, surrounded by the Highland Rim. It's like a bowl with a rim around it. And then you have this area, the pink area, moving into West Tennessee, and then the fertile Delta River region of the Mississippi River. So geography is important. And I talk to a lot of teachers from time to time, and they always express some frustration over the teaching of the standards because they feel that they really have no time to do anything except step 1, steps 2, step 3 of the standards. So I always think it's a good way to do this, and this would include in any U.S. history class, is to find out about your students and to help them find their stories. Now, for example, how many of you live in the same town where you grew up? Some of you do, some of you don't. People are in motion, and in any public school class, you're going to find a lot of children that have, and high school students as well, who have moved a lot. And so the question gets to be, why did you come? What happened after you got here? That's history right there. Why did people come here? Why did the Native Americans come to where they came? Why did they settle there? What happened? What pushed them away from where they were? What pulled them to the place where they ended up? And most of you probably moved because of a parent's job or your job, or you married somebody, but people are in movement. Now, this map is a very old map that used to be on a counter down at the State Archives. I'm not sure that it's still down there, but I really like this map because it really tells you a lot about Tennessee history, and in particular, who came. Now, if you look, you see a very direct migration pattern down the Appalachian Mountains, and somebody sooner or later is going to take a step and step right over into Tennessee. Now, this pattern here coming down, anybody have any idea who those people might have been?
Donaldson?
Well, no, not exactly. Not specifically names, but more of a group.
It's a lot of the English and I believe the Germans.
Well, they were actually Scots-Irish. The Scots-Irish were primarily folks who lived in Scotland, who had moved over to Ireland for a while after Great Britain or England took over Ireland. They didn't like it very much over there, so they went back to Scotland and ultimately came here. Now, most of these Scots-Irish were Presbyterians because that was the national church of Scotland. And they were fiercely independent people. Most of them did not have enough money to pay for their passage, so how did they come?
Indentured servants.
Indentured servants. And that is my ancestry through and through. I've sent my DNA off to Ancestry.com, and I'm almost 100% Scots-Irish. Some of you are, some of you are not, but your students will be quite a mix of nationalities there. But the Scots-Irish came in mostly as indentured servants. As they worked off their contract, they began moving westward and looking for opportunity. And opportunity is really an important word when you're talking about Tennessee history, because all of this movement from East Tennessee, making that great leap over the Cumberland Plateau to Middle Tennessee, and then the settlement of West Tennessee by Americans after the War of 1812, all of those moves, those leaps, had to do with opportunity. People move around because they are looking for a better life. So one thing that I think is really fun to do with your students, the first of school, and I do this in my Tennessee history classes all the time and generally in my U.S. history. How did the town in which you live get named? Does anybody in here know how Gallatin got named? Albert Gallatin was a Swiss immigrant who became a congressman from western Pennsylvania and became Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury. Albert Gallatin, when he was in Congress, the year happened to be 1796, the year that Tennessee became a state. And that whole election, the whole fight in Congress, which there was a tremendous fight, was due to the fact that 1796 was an election year. So Albert Gallatin, along with James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, worked out a compromise so that Tennessee could become a state in 1796 before the national election. Because that election, you will remember, is the one that was the first really contested election. George Washington had said, I'm going home to Mount Vernon. It's time for somebody else to take this position. And we had John Adams, the vice president, the Federalist candidate, running against Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, by the Republican Democratic Party. More or less, they were become parties. And so it was going to be contested. So guess which side did not want Tennessee to become a state until after the presidential election? Federalist or Jeffersonian Republican Democrats?
Jefferson.
No, it was the Federalists, because they assumed that just by the location of this state, Tennessee, that Tennessee was going to vote for Thomas Jefferson because of the proximity. And it was those New England Federalists who did not want it to become a state because they were convinced that our electoral votes would go for Jefferson. So a compromise was worked out, and Albert Gallatin was given a lot of credit for working out that compromise. As a result of that, the citizens of Tennessee named the county seat of Sumner County after Albert Gallatin. It's a really interesting story. Tennessee's statehood, Walter Durham, who was the state historian for many years, he's now deceased, but he wrote a book about the Southwest Territory. He wrote several books about Tennessee history, and he said, he argues that Tennessee's fight to get admitted to the Union was the hardest of any other state that was ready to be a state, a territory that was ready to be a state. So that was his argument, that Tennessee had a very difficult time. So what about your county? Do you know who Wilson County was named for? Davidson County, Sumner County. These are all interesting things, and your students, I think, will have fun. Tell them to go home and ask their parents these questions. What was our state named for? It was named for this river with the Big Bend, from a word that some say was Cherokee, some say it was Yuchi, but it was a Native American term for the river. That was what our state was named for. And what about your school? There are schools all over Sumner County that are named for people: Merrill Hyde, Venus Stewart, Guild Elementary. And I would imagine that the teachers themselves are not really sure who any of those people are. So ask your students to go find out who the school was named for. Find out who the state was named for. Now, that's theme number one, is geography. How has the land affected our history? All right, now this is what you might call Tennessee exceptionalism. Tennessee's history is different from all other states. And that's because we are so special here in Tennessee. But in particular, I think you will see that Tennessee's history is quite different from the history of the other states that ultimately seceded and joined the Confederacy. Tennessee's geography had a lot to do with why our history was different, because our geography is so diverse. You had a strong presence in the state of Tennessee of Unionists, people who wanted to stay in the Union and not secede. So you see this also in lots of other areas of Tennessee history and U.S. history, especially in the civil rights movement. Cynthia Fleming, who teaches at the University of Tennessee, has a very fine article about Tennessee and the civil rights movement. And she argues that although we certainly had some violence, we had a lot of resistance, that by and large, Tennessee's civil rights movement was far more moderate than the other states that left the Union. So think about that. What other ways is Tennessee's history different from the other states of the Confederacy? So certainly secession. Tennessee had 2 votes on leaving the Union, one in February of 1861 and a second in June of 1861. What made us change our minds? Why did we vote more or less to stay in the Union and then 4 months later decide to join the Confederate States?
A lovely letter from Abraham Lincoln.
What?
A lovely letter from Abraham Lincoln to the governor.
Well, actually, it's a little more complicated than that. But yes, there's a lot to do. There's a lot to do with that, and we'll get to that here in just a minute. And then I think that this is another important theme of the Tennessee history. If you go down to the state capitol, what you see are 3 presidents presented in about 5 different ways, I think. There are pictures of Jackson, Polk, and Johnson in many places in the Tennessee state capitol. We also know that Tennessee has contributed a lot to American culture. Now, we think about country music as and music in general, blues, folk music, bluegrass music, but we don't really necessarily think about religion. And Tennessee has probably had more religious denominations founded in our state than any other state, with the possible exception of Massachusetts. Because Tennessee's religious heritage is a heritage of people who, when they disagree, what do? They adapt. They will go and form their own denomination. For example, the Presbyterians dominated Middle Tennessee from the time of its founding. But one of the things that the Presbyterian denomination, which has a national organization, it's a series of levels. You've got the presbytery, the synod, and then the General Assembly at the top. That denomination requires that all of its pastors, preachers, ministers have a college degree in theology. And out here on the frontier in 1796, in 1800, it was hard to get people who had college degrees to want to move out here. So what do you do when the situation precludes you from doing what you need to do to have a religious body? You adapt. And what you do is found your own denomination, the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, which was founded over in Dixon County. There's a nice historic marker over there in the Montgomery Bell State Park. Some folks got together and said, we're Presbyterians, but we're going to change our theology, our rules to some degree, in that we're not going to require ministers to have a college degree. You see that happening with this group that became known as the Restoration Churches. there were a lot of people in the Second Great Awakening, 1800 to about 1830, who wanted to take a step backward from all the religious denominations and have a church that was modeled on the New Testament. Now, these are Christian churches, and we do have a lot of religious diversity beyond Christian churches in Tennessee. But these folks wanted to restore the New Testament church. And so they just began to call themselves Churches of Christ or Christian churches. And at one point, they were very connected with the Baptist churches, which form of organization is quite different from Presbyterians or Methodists. And the Baptist church split, and one group followed Alexander Campbell. And so you will see that group growing these restoration churches, which before the Civil War were really called Churches of Christ or Christian churches. They were interchangeable. And then after the Civil War, you began to see that group, which was actually quite large because it was congregational in terms of its church structure. There's no governing body that tells you anything you have to do. The deacons of a church are the authority in that church, and they can't necessarily fulfill everything that some people think a church can have. So, for example, and I don't want to step on any toes here, but if you can't get a musical instrument for your church because they're expensive, what do? You look back to the New Testament and say the New Testament churches did not have musical instruments, therefore we will not have musical instruments. And eventually, these two denominations will become quite distinct. The Disciples of Christ or Christian churches and the Churches of Christ. And you look at that Tennessee border between Tennessee and Kentucky, and you'll see a lot more Disciples of Christ, Christian churches in Kentucky than you will see Churches of Christ. And in Tennessee, we have more Churches of Christ than we have Disciples of Christ or Christian churches. And you could drive down I-65 from Kentucky to Alabama and stop in every Church of Christ or Disciples of Christ church along the way, and you're going to see slightly different interpretations of what it means to be a New Testament church. So we contributed a lot to the subject of religion that most people in Tennessee don't see is one of our great contributions to the nation. And then, of course, people are aware of the politics and the presidents from Tennessee and the other elected officials who have gotten national attention. So anytime you're teaching U.S. history, whether it's in the standards or not, your students are really going to want to know what was going on over here. They may not tell you that, but it makes more sense if you know what's going on where you are. I have students right now who are college students who have no interest in living anywhere other than where they live right now. And so they're not really particularly interested in something that took place in Boston. They're not particularly interested in transcendentalism. There are a lot of things they're not particularly interested in, but you do get their attention when you talk about things going on. So, as you know, these English colonies grew far more rapidly than the French and the Spanish, and so soon there is going to be a collision of these cultures as the population of the 13 colonies grew and the French population didn't. And so this will lead to what becomes the French and Indian War, the 17 Years' War, because the French wanted to have exclusive trading agreements with the Indian tribes, as the fur in Canada had been depleted because of overkilling of the beaver. And so as they came south looking for trading partners and the English population is moving westward, you see they collide, and that is really what caused the French and Indian War. And it is in some of the social studies standards. As I mentioned, here come these Scots-Irish, and they are fiercely independent folks who don't really like to obey rules very much. So here are some of the Scots-Irish. Know this guy?
Davy Crockett.
Davy Crockett. Actually, he preferred to call himself David, but Walt Disney called him Davy, so I call him Davy. This one is less familiar. That's James Robertson. Depending on where you live, you get a different interpretation of Tennessee history. If you go to East Tennessee, the father of Tennessee history is our state's first governor, John Sevier. Over here, the father of Tennessee history is James Robertson, another Scots-Irish, and then finally Andrew Jackson, another one who his family had come into the Carolinas. There's a strong presence of Scots-Irish over in the area of Charlotte. Davidson College is a Presbyterian school that was founded very early there. So for all of these people, why did they come? What brought them here? And it was opportunity. These folks who came to Tennessee early were not really coming for religious reasons, which of course that's what my students have learned, that everybody who came to the 13 colonies came for religious reasons. Only a small group came, and even that group, they were looking for financial opportunities, a better life. And these are the folks that are going to come across the mountains and settle here in Tennessee. Now, I'm going to show you some maps. And again, I'll give you all of these. The UT Geography Department did these maps too, and I'm happy to share them with you because I think this really says a lot. So I'm going to show you these maps, and after you look at these, I want you to draw a conclusion about them. Now, you probably won't be able to read the fine print up there as to what the counties are. Sullivan, Washington, Greene, and Hawkins, Sumner, Davidson, and Tennessee County. This is before statehood, remember. This is Tennessee County is Robertson, Stewart, part of Cheatham County, part of Dixon County. So this is Tennessee, and all the black area has been reserved for the Indian tribes. When the first settlers came into the Cumberland region, led by John Donaldson and James Robertson, they had an agreement that they would settle above the Cumberland River. And as you see from this map, they were already below the Cumberland River here. Does anybody know what this line is here? This is called the Great Divide of Tennessee. It's like the Continental Divide. All the water on this side flows to the Tennessee. All the water over here flows to the Cumberland River. All right, you're drawing a conclusion about Tennessee history here. 4 years after statehood, 14 years after statehood, after the War of 1812. Who's in the White House in 1830?
Jackson.
General Jackson. Who is the only crew left here? Cherokees, holding on tight. And you know what's going to happen to them. 1840. So what do you think? What do these maps say, collectively?
More settlement of white people.
Yeah, people came, people populated the area, and the cost of that was for the Native Americans. It was that they continued signing treaties, giving up land, and ultimately even the Cherokees, who more than any other tribe tried to compromise and adapt with the settlers, even they could not hold on to their land. And Jackson supported the Indian Removal Act. He thought that it was the only way he could protect the tribes, And I want you to think about that, because he felt like Americans had been taking Indian land for such a long time, and the only way to prevent Americans from taking Indian land would be to literally send the army. And what if that American says, shoot me, I'm not leaving, stubborn Scots-Irish that I am, I'm not leaving. It's going to be rather ugly if the U.S. Army deliberately shoots an American citizen. And so Jackson said that he could not do anything to prevent people from taking the land. And maybe there is something to be thought of about that. Very little of history is black and white. There's all these gray areas and lots of things that we still kind of debate the what ifs here. As you see, Tennessee's got lots of counties. We got up to 96 before we got back down to 95 counties in the state. For our geographical square miles in the state, we are one of the highest number of counties for the number of square miles we have. Does anybody know why we have so many counties? Tennesseans like to argue. The counties are all created by the General Assembly of Tennessee. And the General Assembly creates counties when people start debating one thing or another and say, well, we can't get along here, so we're going to have our own county, and the General Assembly will create it. Now, take in case in point here. Here you see 1840, Sumner County, Smith County, and Wilson County. No Macon County. There it is. It's appearing on the map. And why did they want to be a county? Because they felt that all of the state money was being spent in Gallatin and not enough was being spent in that county. It's a tiny population of Macon County. Now, what you don't see here on this map is Trousdale County. Trousdale County is not going to be created till after the Civil War. There's Trousdale County, which got created after the Civil War. When I first started teaching here, Sumner County we all had a really cold winter. And Sumner County schools did not meet for several weeks. I mean, it was a lot of ice on the ground. And so you can imagine that parents had a lot of different opinions about whether they should be meeting. Some said, let's get these kids back in school. Others said, no, the roads are too dangerous. So at that point, the folks who lived in Portland and Westmoreland, which are very near the Kentucky border, asked the legislature to create Highland County and up on the Highland Rim. They felt that the school board made its decisions about closing based on what Hendersonville and to a lesser degree Gallatin wanted, so they wanted the legislature to create Highland County. So Sumner County got the message, and they started putting people from Portland and Westmoreland on the Sumner County School Board, and that separate county up there kind of dissipated after all of this. But it's really interesting to look at these maps and look at what happened here and what they tell us about Tennessee history. So you know about the Articles of Confederation leading to the Constitution. They didn't work. An important thing, I think, to look at as you think about the Articles, fast forward to 1860, and the discussions about leaving the Union had begun a lot earlier than 1860, but when 7 states seceded from the Union in 1860 and 61, what did they name their country? The Confederate States of America. And there is a connection. Under the Articles of Confederation, where did ultimate authority reside? With the states. Now, the Constitution is a federal system. So you've got the states and the national government sharing responsibility. And of course, there are some contradictions in the Constitution. For those of you who teach government, you know the Article 6 of the Constitution says this Constitution and the laws created under it are the supreme law of the land, the Supremacy Clause, right? And yet there's Amendment 10 over there. All rights, not all things not expressly specified in this Constitution are reserved for the states. So different people read the Constitution in different ways. There's lots of debate even today. It's heavily debated and heavily contested. So we went into the Constitutional Convention. One of the delegates there was a North Carolina land speculator, William Blount. When the Southwest Territory was created, after Washington became president, William Blount lobbied Washington asking to be the governor of the Southwest Territory, the territorial governor. Why did land speculator William Blount want to be the territorial governor so badly? He and his brother had bought up hundreds of thousands of acres of land here in Tennessee by buying land grants from the Revolutionary War. North Carolina had had to pay its soldiers in land. They had no money, and they gave them land across the Appalachian Mountains in this area. And Blount and his brothers owned all of this, and he wanted to come over here because, of course, he wants the area to become a state, because statehood will make more people want to come, and you will be able to sell this land. You know, land speculation is an important part of Tennessee history. You buy it low, take it from the Indians, I guess, is also there too, and the objective is using land as capital, as money. You invest in a piece of stock because you expect it to rise. And so that was what a lot of people in Tennessee's history, early history, were land speculators. James Robertson, John Donaldson, John Sevier, they were all involved in land speculation. And so the Constitution has been debated, and it is still debated, and it is debated here in Tennessee. And the question is, how do you read the Constitution? And I've already covered this here. It was a political battle that looked like it was going to be, that Tennessee would not become a state. But the one thing that has kept this country together throughout its entire history, except for that one exception, the Civil War, was our ability to compromise. And the compromise that enabled Tennessee to become a state, based on our population, we should have had 2 United States representatives, and we were going to have 2 senators. That would have been 4 electoral votes. So it was agreed that Tennessee would only have 1 U.S. representative until the federal government took an official census in 1800. So our electoral vote would be 3 instead of 4. And we did, in fact, participate in that presidential election, and guess who got all 3 of our votes? Thomas Jefferson. We had lots of Virginians moving over here. Now, there's lots of debate about land, and everybody had an interest in the land here in Tennessee. And this is particularly important in West Tennessee, where the Chickasaws, that land has been reserved by treaty for the Chickasaws. But Tennessee felt it was all ours. North Carolina felt that its land grants had to be honored, and the federal government thought that they should supervise this too. So you see all manner of debates about who's going to control this land and how it's going to be used. And throughout this early period of Tennessee history, you see the Indians signing treaty after treaty after treaty. all of these treaties, it was treaty after treaty after treaty until ultimately there were no Indian tribes living in Tennessee. Tecumseh is an interesting story. He came south. He was this is what is called sometimes the Indian Revival Movement. He said, we tribes have got to unite and quit signing all of these independent treaties. We've got to go back to our original ways. This sort of sounds like the Second Great Awakening. We should speak our own language. We should give up their religion, their traditions, their way of dress. We need to unite and come together. And his brother Tenskwatawa got a lot of attention because he predicted the New Madrid earthquakes in 1811 and 1812 that created Reelfoot Lake here in Tennessee. So we have a lot of interesting history related to coming up to the War of 1812 and what happened afterwards. Now, another important thing about the War of 1812 is that it put Andrew Jackson in the national spotlight overnight. He claimed, his admirers called him the second George Washington. The first George Washington had saved the country from Great Britain. And now the second George Washington, Andrew Jackson, had saved us from Great Britain again by defeating the British at the Battle of New Orleans. It is shortly after this that a Quaker iron worker, he had come down here and invested in iron foundries. Elihu Emory began the nation's first anti-slavery newspaper. The Emancipator was published in Jonesboro for a short period of time. It was discontinued after Emory died, but in the beginning, abolishing slavery, or let us just say, saying that slavery is morally wrong, began in the South. And it mostly began with people of faith. A Quaker here, pacifist. Then you see other preachers saying this is contrary to the Bible. So as slavery becomes a bigger part of the economy of the South, of course, those preachers who are preaching that slavery is contrary to the Bible will leave the state, and you'll have preachers who preach what the congregations want to hear. So we have Sequoyah, a really, really interesting story, how he is the only human being in all of world history who from scratch created by himself a syllabary or alphabet. Here we have Rachel and Andrew Jackson. We focus so much on General Jackson, and I think that sometimes we need to think a little bit about these women who are around. And so I printed for you a letter. Well, this is not the letter. This is a typed transcription of a letter that Andrew Jackson wrote to his friend Dr. Call right after he found out he was going to become president, but before he was sworn in. The date is December 22nd, 1828. And if you read this letter, you hear him telling his friend that he's been busy and hasn't had time to write. And then Mrs. J was, a few days past, suddenly and violently attacked with pains in her left shoulder and breast, and such the contraction of the breast that suffocation was apprehended before the necessary aid could be afforded. Dr. Hogg has relieved her, and although worse today than yesterday, I trust in the kind providence that he will restore her to her usual health. So Rachel Jackson is probably about 69, 70 years old, and she is having pains in her chest. She is a sedentary woman. She eats a diet That was the diet of my grandparents for sure. Lots of fat in everything. You put it in the beans, you put it in everything you cook. She had a sedentary life. She is known to have smoked on occasion. What was going on with Rachel Jackson that day?
She had a heart attack.
She was having a heart attack. So what do you think Dr. Hogg did to treat her for her heart attack? He bled her. Ugh, hard to think about. This was right before she died. Now, we've talked about the Indian Removal Act. I do want to point out that one Tennessean was brave enough to vote against it, and that was Mr. Crockett, David. And this is a pure legend. We have no tape recording, no video of this. But Jackson was angry with Crockett for voting against the Indian Removal Act and persuaded Adam Huntsman to run against him for his congressional seat in West Tennessee. So this is where the Crockett enthusiasts say that Crockett himself said, Andrew Jackson can go to hell, Davy Crockett is going to Texas. Probably not true, but he did leave. And as you know, in the parlance of preschool education, teaching children to make right decisions, he didn't make a very good decision, did he? So Indian removal comes. The important thing I want to point out about Indian removal, just to show you that history is very much alive and people are constantly learning more and more about it. A few years ago, some men who were not particularly educated but knew that they had some Cherokee ancestry started trying to find records of the Trail of Tears and to find out what they could find doing just basic genealogy. And in going through a lot of Trail of Tears papers and documents, they found that one of the many branches of the trail, there were multiple trails, we should call them the Trails of Tears, came right up the Stones River from Murfreesboro. There was a town over there called Jefferson, Tennessee in Rutherford County, right up along the Stones River into where it flows into the Cumberland in Donaldson, probably a mile, maybe less from the Hermitage. And then they followed the Cumberland, crossed the bridge in Nashville, right by the courthouse. The bridge is not there. There's part of the trail down that the Trail of Tears National Park Service has now marked along the Stones River. I went down there with a group one day from historic Nashville and was totally mesmerized by what I could see. That's the footings of the bridge that they crossed as they made their way to Indian Territory. So that is the Trail of Tears. And here we have James K. Polk. This is another person who's on the national stage. His popularity has probably diminished somewhat over the past 40 or 50 years, primarily because he, like a lot of other people living in Nashville, owned a plantation in Mississippi. And he and Sarah Childers Polk never lived on that plantation, but it was a financial investment to make money, and he had an overseer, and those absentee landlord plantations have come under tremendous criticism since we have learned more about what that meant. His election, I think, is very important, particularly for those of you who remember the election of 2000, the year 2000, when Al Gore and George W. Bush ran against each other. If Al Gore had carried Tennessee, Florida would not have mattered. Florida would not have mattered. But Tennessee has often voted differently from the rest of the South. Here we voted for Henry Clay from Kentucky, of all places, before we voted for Polk. But why did Polk lose? A group calling themselves the Liberty Party, wanting to prevent the spread of slavery, took just enough votes from Clay for Polk to win the electoral vote. So there are lots of maps about this. We can talk a lot about slavery in Tennessee. Before the Civil War, Dred Scott decision was voted on by the Supreme Court. It was determined that slaves and indeed African Americans had no rights to sue in the federal court system. This will ultimately lead to the 14th Amendment, giving African American men the right to citizenship, equal process under the law. But the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court wrote the decision, Roger Taney, but one of the justices who voted with Taney in the majority opinion there was John Catron, who was a Jackson appointee, and he was from Tennessee. So we've got lots of different things to say about the South and about Tennessee being different from those other states in the South. Cotton, as you see, you can see where cotton was raised here in Tennessee. West Tennessee, you can see where the heaviest cotton production was, and that's where the African American population was indeed the highest. So as you look at the Civil War and you look at these three grand divisions of the state, there were very few slaves living in East Tennessee in 1860. The reason there was not a financial incentive in East Tennessee to own slaves. Most of the people lived on these mom and pop hill and valley farms, subsistence farmers. And then in West Tennessee, which opened up after we pushed the Chickasaws out after the War of 1812, when that was opened up to cotton production, the population of slaves over there shot up exponentially. It shot up so fast that when we had a constitutional convention in 1834 to rewrite Tennessee's first constitution, slavery was the hottest topic there. And eventually they came up with a plank in the Constitution, a section that says no one can free a slave in Tennessee without the owner's consent. Now, up to that Constitution, there still were in 1860 a lot of free blacks living in Middle Tennessee in particular, but up to that point, they could vote. They could own property, they could vote. The Constitution of 1834 took voting rights away from free blacks. Why? Because all of the population of slaves over here has gone up so fast, and we don't want slaves to see free black people because that might give them ideas. Tennessee was very, very divided. So here comes the Civil War. 1860, South Carolina secedes. Our governor is Isham G. Harris from West Tennessee. He wants Tennessee to secede quickly. He's all for secession. So the legislature comes into session in February and, they're kind of a little bit nervous about this. So they say, let's have a referendum and let's see what the voters of Tennessee want to do about leaving the Union. East Tennessee votes no. We see no need to have a convention to talk about seceding. We see no need to secede. West Tennessee, yes, yes, yes. So Middle Tennessee was the pivot of the seesaw. And in February, we voted with East Tennessee. Lincoln is sworn in March. In April, the Confederate militia of South Carolina attacks a military installation on an island in the harbor of Charleston, Fort Sumter. President Lincoln called for troops. This time, the legislature writes, we're the only state that publishes a state declaration of independence, the Tennessee Declaration of Independence. It's conditional on the vote of the people. East Tennessee, do you want to declare yourselves to be independent? No. West Tennessee, do you want to declare yourself to be independent? Yes. And this time, Middle Tennessee voted with West Tennessee. Lincoln called for troops. His Secretary of War, Simon Cameron had sent a letter, a telegram to Governor Harris calling for troops to put down the Southern Rebellion, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. We will not send a single soldier to fight our Southern Brotherhood, is the response that Governor Harris sent to Simon Cameron, the Secretary of War. And in talking about that election of Lincoln, you know that Lincoln was this representative of this new party, the nominee of the Republican Party, whose tenet was, we want to prevent slavery from spreading into the territories. So there were some, including this Tennessean John Bell, who said, we don't like any of the choices, Stephen Douglas, John Breckinridge, or Abraham Lincoln. We'll create our own party, the Constitutional Union Party. Let's just not talk about it and uphold the Constitution. And that's how the election turned out. Tennessee voted for Bell, the Constitutional Union candidate. Now, in closing here, I want to say a little bit about the Emancipation Proclamation. I don't want to neglect any of this by not talking about what happened with the freeing of the slaves. If you went down to Walmart down here just a mile away and stood out there and said to the people who came in, how did slavery end in this country? They'd say the Emancipation Proclamation. Every person would say that because they think that's the case. The Emancipation Proclamation was a military strategy on the part of Lincoln, saying that it was issued after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, saying, I will, for all slaves in states still in rebellion on January 1st, will be freed. States still in rebellion on January 1st. Now, if you're Jefferson Davis, what's your response going to be?
How are you telling? You're not in charge.
You're not in charge. I'm the president of this, and we're a confederacy. You have no business. You can't free any slaves in our states. I think that President Lincoln and his advisors actually thought that due to the casualties in the war, that one southern state might decide to come back. And that did not happen. But it's important for you to understand that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free any slaves. There were 4 states where slavery was legal still in the Union: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And Tennessee was expressly exempted from the proclamation. And here's why. This is in the Library of Congress papers, and these are wonderful documents. A group of citizens sent a letter to the president, to some Tennesseans in Washington, and said, see if you can get President Lincoln to exempt Tennessee, because we're Unionists and we've supported the Union, and when this war is over, we're going to have a lot of trouble with our Confederate neighbors if Tennessee slaves are freed. So the letters were sent. These are they're lovely to look at, and you see the names of the people who signed them. There are a few names on there that we have never been able to transcribe accurately, but they are on the Library of Congress website. There are a couple of letters about this, and so Tennessee was expressly exempted. Now, the 13th Amendment freed the slaves. It made slavery illegal. However, before the 13th Amendment, in March 1865, the Tennessee legislature went ahead and amended the old Constitution to make slavery illegal. So Tennessee willingly abolished slavery in Tennessee before the 13th Amendment, and I think that that's really important too. There are different ways to teach Reconstruction. And was this period really as bad as some people's great-grandmothers tell them it was? Were the Yankees all over the place, just those carpetbaggers? Or how in fact, was Tennessee brought back into the Union? Why were we the first state to be brought back into the Union? Why did Tennessee escape military reconstruction? Those are important questions that I think really will tell you a lot about how Tennessee is different from the other southern states. So it is time for your break. Stacy, have we got time for a question or two?
Yeah, of course.
Anything about what I've said or any of the things related to the second half of the story as well?
I always see this, excuse me, I'm so sorry. I always see this where obviously they were exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation, but there was a lot of slaves going into Nashville and being recruited. How was that happening?
That is a very important point. He said Tennessee was exempt, the slaves were emancipating themselves. And this is one thing that, as I have been teaching Tennessee history, you don't really think about what you're saying until you say it and somebody points it out to you. Because the way that this all is presented is that magnanimous white people said, we are going to free you. We are going to give you the right to vote. We are going to give you equality under the law. And it's very important to understand that none of this giving was voluntary. And so this whole story of emancipation should be told from the perspective of the African Americans, because I know, and even if you don't have a single African American in your class, you still need to teach it properly. And the word traveled, and they knew, slaves on plantations in West Tennessee knew if they could get behind the Union lines, they would be free. They emancipated themselves. When women got the right to vote in 1920, the way that story was told, because until the Civil Rights Movement, men wrote most of the histories of the United States, it's we gave women the right to vote. Well, what we should be saying is not that we gave women the right to vote, but that women put up a fierce fight and demanded the right to vote, and it was only given because of a fight. And that's the same is true of the Civil Rights Movement. Those students who sat on those lunch counters in Nashville, they felt they had a right to be there. If they hadn't done it, those restaurants downtown would be segregated to this day. You've got to have somebody to say, what am I willing to fight for? And if you've ever heard Congressman John Lewis, who's a congressman now in the U.S. Congress, speak, he was at the American Baptist College as a student. He was born poor sharecropping family down in northern Alabama. He was one of, I think, 11 children. He came up here to be a minister. He said that they all really and firmly believed they were going to be killed. They were going to be martyrs to the cause. But they felt like that was what it was going to take before white people ever broke down the walls of segregation. And so we do tell these stories from our own perspective. And that is something that all of us as educators really have to work on, because there are multiple perspectives about emancipation. And the fact of the matter is, they started walking off the plantation. They got the word. They heard. They knew what was going on. Other question? Yes?
Not necessarily a question, but you talked about the geography of Tennessee, like the Scots-Irish. I read something a couple weeks ago that was really interesting, is when you go all the way back to like Pangea and the Appalachians being the oldest mountains in the world, one of the areas that split when Pangea split was the Appalachians. Yeah. And the part that split was Scotland and Ireland and America. Yeah. When they move here, they naturally move to that area that they're from, but it's like literally this same mountain range that they moved to.
That is an interesting connection. Now that, I haven't heard that connection made, but I'm not going to say it's not right, because, I mean, it certainly is kind of interesting to think about that. You know, if you saw those movies, Braveheart or Rob Roy, you know, Mel Gibson in a kilt, these people had been fighting that border war with England for hundreds of years, so they were accustomed to fighting. You know, some people in England referred to the Revolutionary War, our war, as the Presbyterian War. They blamed the Scots-Irish for coming over here and stirring up all the trouble. The fact of the matter is, in the South, there were lots of loyalists. They were very loyal to the crown. And so you see what kind of lifestyle the wealthy people in the South had. They had the equivalent of the big manor house that the oldest brother got in Great Britain. And so the manor house was controlled by the lord of the manor, and there were all these peasants working the land. And so you've got the plantation with the plantation owner, the patriarch at the top, and all these slaves working the land. So there are lots of loyalist sentiment in the South during the Revolutionary War. And that's why I think ultimately Parliament and the generals said, well, let's just isolate New England, and because that's where all the troublemakers are up there in Massachusetts, let's just isolate New York and Massachusetts and up in New England, and we'll go down south, send some soldiers down south, and all those loyalists will come to our side. And that's what led to the Battle of Kings Mountain, where those over mountain men decided to go and fight with the North Carolina militia. And they defeated this very fine British army at the Battle of Kings Mountain, which was indeed a turning point in the Revolutionary War in the South. Now, since I live in Middle Tennessee, you know, I like to remind people that this area had already been settled. And so these people, James Robertson, John Donaldson, none of them went to Kings Mountain. They did not fight in the Revolutionary War, unless you might say that some of the people who came over here were part of the Regulator movement in North Carolina. That possibly could be looked at as sort of a prequel to the Revolutionary War, but it took place in 1771, so kind of hard to say there. But it's important to know that the folks here were still, during 1780, 81, 82, 83, contesting holding this land because the Indian attacks were so fierce. And that raises another question. If Robertson and Donaldson decided to come over here, and they were hired by Richard Henderson to bring people over here and settle, why did they come in the middle of the Revolutionary War? Well, I think Henderson, who was quite the entrepreneur, and he saw opportunity. You know, he had signed this treaty with the Cherokees, the Transylvania Purchase, and I think Henderson said, let's go get some people living over there. No matter who wins the war, we'll have people on it, so it'll be ours. So there's a lot of that that's still out there to be learned, but that early history of Middle Tennessee, which you really can't go into even in a high school class, is really quite interesting. And the reason that they left over the Cumberland Plateau was because the land here was so much better. You know, people said this was the Eden of the West. And in the fall and the spring, it sure looks like Eden to me. It's beautiful here in Middle Tennessee.